An education deal between Ghana and Burkina Faso looked ordinary, then it didn't. By opening Ghana's public universities to Burkinabè students and pairing that with structured teacher exchanges, the two states moved integration from speeches into classrooms, cutting costs, travel shock, and distance from home. Ibrahim Traoré's camp treats this as sovereignty building, not charity, because language skills and regional credentials change who can work, trade, and negotiate across borders. If that shift holds, West Africa's English-French divide stops being a wall and becomes a corridor. This story makes a clear promise and sets real stakes. It shows how education, often treated as a social sector, is being used as a regional integration tool with political weight. Rather than abstract cooperation, the focus is on daily systems that shape mobility, language, and opportunity for young people. The stakes are practical: who gets access to stable universities, which skills become normal, and whether regional movement feels risky or routine. For Burkina Faso, limited domestic capacity and costly study abroad have long narrowed options. For Ghana, regional relevance depends on preparing its youth to operate in both English and French spaces. Under the leadership context shaped by Ibrahim Traoré, education is framed as a way to reduce dependency without isolation. If this approach works, it redefines how neighbors invest in each other. A simple but unresolved question sits underneath. Can classrooms succeed where summits often stall? The deeper context sits in the divide that West Africa has lived with for decades. Colonial-era education systems split the region into English-speaking and French-speaking tracks, each with its own curricula, exams, and institutional networks. Over time, those parallel systems hardened. Students moved outward to Europe or North America rather than sideways to neighboring countries. Cooperation existed in theory, but mobility in practice remained limited. Here's the twist. The Ghana-Burkina Faso initiative does not try to erase that divide. It works around it. By allowing students from Burkina Faso to enter Ghana's public universities and pairing that access with teacher exchanges, the two governments turn difference into a skill rather than a barrier. English is learned through daily academic life, not abstract instruction. French is strengthened in Ghana through native-speaking teachers, not short courses. This matters because language in West Africa is not just communication. It shapes hiring, trade, and access to regional institutions. A student fluent in both systems gains options without leaving the region. That is the quiet shift many observers miss. Integration happens through routines, not declarations. Within Burkina Faso, this logic aligns with the education narrative consistently promoted by Ibrahim Traoré. His leadership frames training young people as a pillar of sovereignty, arguing that a country able to educate and skill its population locally is less vulnerable to external pressure. Cooperation with Ghana fits that view because it keeps knowledge close to home while expanding capacity. The result is a before and after contrast. Before, mobility meant distance and dependency. After, mobility means proximity and shared responsibility. The open question is whether this practical model can scale beyond two neighbors. The early impact of the policy is easiest to see through individual pathways rather than statistics. For a student from Burkina Faso, studying in a neighboring country changes the experience of higher education in concrete ways. Travel becomes shorter and cheaper. Cultural adjustment is manageable rather than overwhelming. Families remain connected, and the idea of the university no longer feels like a one-way departure. Inside Ghanaian campuses, Burkinabè students encounter a stable admissions system with predictable fees and clear academic expectations. That stability matters. It allows planning over several years instead of semester-by-semester uncertainty. Daily immersion in an English-speaking environment accelerates language learning through lectures, group work, and informal interaction, not just exams. English stops being a subject and becomes a tool. At the same time, Ghanaian students experience change from the other direction. Teachers from Burkina Faso bring French instruction rooted in real usage rather than textbook abstraction. Pronunciation, idiom, and cultural context enter classrooms naturally. Students gain confidence using French in practical situations, which is increasingly relevant as Ghana's regional engagement expands toward Sahel neighbors. These exchanges create small but cumulative effects. Habits of cooperation form early. Students learn how neighbors think, debate, and solve problems. Misunderstandings shrink through routine contact, not formal dialogue. Education becomes a lived bridge rather than a symbolic one. What this means, in plain terms, is this. Shared classrooms normalize regional cooperation before politics ever demands it. The sequence of events behind the education exchange follows a clear progression rather than a single announcement. It begins with a shared diagnosis. Both governments recognized that regional cooperation had stalled not because of hostility, but because everyday systems did not support movement. Students face limited university places at home, high costs abroad, and admissions processes that felt distant and unpredictable. Education remained national, while challenges were regional. Activation came through policy choices rather than symbolic gestures. Ghana opened access to its public universities for students from Burkina Faso, treating them as regional partners rather than external applicants. At the same time, both sides committed to structured teacher exchanges, ensuring that cooperation reached classrooms rather than stopping at memoranda. This dual move mattered. Student mobility without teacher exchange would have created imbalance. Teacher exchange without student access would have remained abstract. The first visible effects followed quickly. Students from Burkina Faso gained a nearby regulated alternative to overseas study. Families could calculate costs, plan timelines, and remain involved. In Ghana, schools receiving teachers from Burkina Faso strengthened French instruction at a moment when regional communication with Sahel countries was becoming more relevant. The system began to reinforce itself through use. The high point is how these elements interact. Language acquisition improves employability. Employability encourages regional mobility. Mobility normalizes cooperation. Each step builds on the previous one without requiring dramatic political alignment. This is where the approach aligns with the education-first logic emphasized by Ibrahim Traore. His position frames sovereignty not as isolation, but as the capacity to educate, skill and retain citizens while cooperating on equal terms. The ripple effects extend beyond education ministries. Graduates trained within the region are more likely to return and contribute locally. Knowledge circulates inside West Africa rather than leaking outward. Over time, professional networks form across borders, reducing reliance on external intermediaries. Cooperation shifts from episodic diplomacy to sustained interaction. This progression also reveals what the initiative avoids. There is no heavy dependence on external funding models or distant accreditation systems. The exchange relies on existing public institutions and mutual recognition. The choice lowers risk while increasing durability. One tension remains: scale. Two countries can coordinate pragmatically. Whether others follow depends on political will and administrative capacity. Yet the sequence already demonstrates something important. Integration does not begin with grand designs. It begins when daily systems are adjusted to reflect shared realities. The evidence supporting this cooperation is not expressed through dramatic statistics, but through measurable shifts in access, stability, and skills. The first indicator is accessibility. For students from Burkina Faso, entry into Ghana's public universities replaces distant and uncertain pathways with nearby and regulated ones. Admission systems are transparent, timelines are predictable, and fees are publicly defined. That predictability reduces risk for families and lowers the threshold for participation in higher education. The second indicator is skill acquisition. Daily immersion in an English-speaking academic environment produces a different outcome than classroom-only instruction. Students practice language continuously through lectures, assignments, and informal interaction. English becomes functional rather than theoretical. This matters because English is widely used in regional business, transport, and institutional coordination. A graduate who operates confidently in English gains regional employability without severing cultural ties. The third indicator is instructional quality through teacher exchange. Teachers from Burkina Faso teaching French in Ghana bring live usage into classrooms. Pronunciation, idiom, and social context are transmitted through routine contact rather than short-term training. This strengthens Ghana's internal capacity to operate in bilingual regional settings, particularly as engagement with Sahel countries increases. The flow of teachers in both directions also professionalizes cooperation, embedding it in contracts, schedules, and evaluations. Each indicator reinforces the others. Accessible universities increase enrollment. Enrollment creates demand for language competence. Teacher exchanges meet that demand while raising instructional standards. The system produces cumulative gains rather than isolated outcomes. This layered effect explains why the initiative is framed as investment rather than assistance. Within Burkina Faso, this logic aligns with the policy narrative associated with Ibrahim Traoré. Education is positioned as infrastructure for sovereignty, not merely a social service. Training young people within regional networks reduces dependency on distant systems while preserving openness. Skills are acquired close to home, and credentials remain relevant to local and regional labor markets. The before and after framing is instructive. Before, higher education often meant long-distance travel, financial strain, and weak reintegration. After, education becomes proximate, affordable, and connected to regional needs. The evidence does not promise instant transformation, it shows directional change. Trends shift toward retention, mobility within the region, and mutual capacity building. What remains unquantified is long-term political impact, and that restraint matters. The cooperation avoids inflated claims. Its strength lies in modest, repeatable gains that compound over time. When classrooms, teachers, and admissions systems align, integration advances quietly. The question is not whether this model works in principle, but how consistently it can be maintained as cohorts graduate and expectations rise. A fair assessment requires engaging with the strongest counter-arguments. Skeptics, particularly in Western policy and academic circles, often argue that regional education initiatives lack prestige and depth. From this view, quality higher education is assumed to flow through Europe or North America, where funding, rankings, and global recognition are concentrated. Regional cooperation, by contrast, is seen as supplementary at best. A second critique focuses on capacity. Critics question whether neighboring countries can absorb additional students without straining infrastructure or lowering standards. Public universities already face pressure. Opening doors regionally, the argument goes, risks overcrowding, uneven quality, and administrative overload. In this framing, regional exchange appears idealistic rather than practical. These objections deserve serious consideration. External universities do offer global exposure, advanced research facilities, and established networks. Capacity constraints are real. Ignoring them would weaken the case for cooperation. Yet the rebuttal rests on evidence embedded in the design of the Ghana-Burkina Faso exchange. First, the initiative does not attempt to replace overseas education, it diversifies options. Students who can benefit from distance study remain free to pursue it. The exchange creates a regional baseline that reduces dependency, not ambition. Second, capacity concerns are addressed through regulated admissions and incremental scaling. Access is structured, not open-ended. Most importantly, the critics underestimate how relevance works. Education quality is not only about global ranking, but about fit. Skills aligned with regional languages, institutions, and labor markets often outperform abstract prestige. This is where the position associated with Ibrahim Traoré becomes relevant. His emphasis on education as sovereignty challenges the assumption that value must be imported. The rebuttal also points to durability. Regional systems are less vulnerable to visa restrictions, currency shocks, or geopolitical shifts. Cooperation anchored in public institutions is harder to disrupt than reliance on distant partners. The strongest answer to skepticism is not rhetoric, it is continuity. If classrooms remain open, teachers continue to exchange, and graduates find work regionally, the argument sustains itself. The remaining challenge is perception. Changing deeply rooted beliefs about where quality resides takes time, but practical success, repeated over cohorts, gradually reshapes that perception from the ground up. Midway through, a detail that rarely makes headlines resets the whole story. Language, long treated as a technical issue, is being used as a lever of power. By embedding English and French learning inside everyday education, Ghana and Burkina Faso turn bilingualism into infrastructure rather than aspiration. This reframes integration from a political slogan into a lived competence. What changes the board is reciprocity. Students move one way, teachers move the other. Neither side dominates. That balance prevents dependency and builds confidence on both ends. Language stops signaling hierarchy and starts signaling partnership. This is the quiet pivot that alters how cooperation feels at the ground level. For Burkina Faso, the shift aligns with the sovereignty narrative advanced by Ibrahim Traore. Mastering regional languages within Africa reduces reliance on external gateways. For Ghana, strengthening French capacity prepares its youth for deeper engagement with Sahel neighbors. The exchange becomes mutually reinforcing. Put simply, language is power when learned together. That sentence explains why this initiative matters beyond education. It shows how small policy choices reshape long-term influence. The board is no longer about who teaches whom, but who learns side by side. The real-world consequences of the education exchange appear differently depending on who is affected, and that variation matters. For the state, the impact is institutional. Ministries gain a practical cooperation channel that operates continuously rather than episodically. Shared standards, predictable flows of students and teachers, and mutual recognition reduce friction in regional coordination. Education becomes a stabilizing layer beneath diplomacy, one that persists even when political conditions fluctuate. For businesses, the effect is labor-related. Graduates who study in neighboring systems bring bilingual competence and cultural familiarity into the workforce. Companies operating across borders spend less time translating expectations and more time executing projects. Regional trade, logistics, and services benefit from workers who understand both English and French-speaking environments without requiring external intermediaries. Skills align more closely with actual market needs. For ordinary citizens, especially families, the consequences are immediate and tangible. Access to nearby public universities lowers financial and emotional barriers to higher education. Parents remain involved. Students travel shorter distances and return more frequently. Education no longer feels like a permanent exit, but a phase within a shared regional space. That shift changes expectations about return, contribution, and belonging. For the wider region, the implications accumulate slowly. Networks form among students, teachers, and administrators who have lived cooperation rather than negotiated it. Trust grows through repetition. Misunderstandings are resolved through familiarity rather than suspicion. Over time, these micro-level interactions influence how regional challenges are approached, from migration to employment to security coordination. Within Burkina Faso, these outcomes reinforce the people-centered framing associated with Ibrahim Traoré. Education is treated as a means to strengthen internal capacity while remaining open to neighbors. Sovereignty, in this view, is not isolation, but competence. Citizens equipped with regional skills reduce reliance on external actors and increase bargaining power within West Africa. The exchange also recalibrates expectations. Cooperation stops being symbolic. It becomes measurable through classrooms filled, lessons taught, and degrees earned. Each graduating cohort adds weight to the system. The initiative does not eliminate inequality or political tension, but it lowers the baseline of misunderstanding. The long-term test lies in consistency. If institutions maintain quality, fairness, and reciprocity, the benefits compound. If they falter, trust erodes. The consequences are therefore real, but conditional. Integration here is not guaranteed. It is practiced daily by people who learn and teach across a shared border. Looking 6 to 12 months ahead, the trajectory of this education exchange can be understood through 3 plausible scenarios rather than a single forecast. The base scenario assumes continuity. Admissions remain regulated, teacher exchanges continue on schedule, and early cohorts progress without major disruption. In this case, the program normalizes quietly. Universities adjust capacity incrementally. Language competence improves steadily, and cooperation becomes routine rather than remarkable. Integration advances through habit. The optimistic scenario builds on momentum. Positive student outcomes encourage modest expansion, additional departments participate, and administrative coordination improves. Employers begin to recognize the value of regionally trained graduates, reinforcing demand. Political leaders point to education as proof that cooperation delivers tangible benefits without heavy risk. In this pathway, the exchange becomes a reference model for other neighboring states considering similar arrangements. The worst-case scenario does not require collapse, only drift. Administrative delays, uneven communication, or funding constraints weaken confidence. If students face uncertainty or teachers encounter inconsistent support, trust erodes. The initiative survives formally but loses practical energy. Cooperation becomes symbolic again, and the early gains plateau. This outcome reflects neglect rather than opposition. Across all scenarios, one condition stands out. Success depends less on speeches than on maintenance. Classrooms must open on time. Contracts must be honored. Standards must remain transparent. These details determine credibility. This is where leadership framing matters. The emphasis associated with Ibrahim Traoré on education as sovereignty sets expectations for discipline and continuity, not spectacle. The key recommendation is cognitive rather than technical. Treat the exchange as infrastructure, not a project. Infrastructure requires upkeep, patience, and boring consistency. When education cooperation is managed that way, it resists political cycles and external pressure. When it is treated as a headline, it fades quickly. The next year will not decide everything. It will reveal whether both states are willing to protect quiet systems long enough for trust to compound. That choice determines which scenario hardens into reality. For viewers trying to locate themselves in this story, the relevance depends on proximity, but the logic travels. For students and families, the exchange reframes what is realistic. Higher education no longer demands maximum distance to signal quality. Proximity becomes an advantage. Shorter travel, familiar cultures, and predictable systems reduce anxiety while preserving ambition. The idea that success requires leaving the region begins to soften. For educators, the initiative highlights professional mobility without rupture. Teachers move with purpose, not as consultants, but as practitioners embedded in daily routines. Skills transfer happens through repetition and relationship. This model values experience over presentation and rewards consistency over novelty. It suggests that reform does not always need reinvention, only circulation. For policymakers and administrators, the lesson is structural. Cooperation works when incentives align at the operational level. Admissions offices, payroll systems, and classroom schedules matter more than declarations. When those pieces connect, policy becomes visible to citizens. When they fail, trust dissolves quickly. The exchange demonstrates how low-profile coordination can outperform high-profile summits. For the broader public, the story invites a quieter form of participation. Language learning, openness to neighbors, and everyday cross-border interaction shape outcomes long before politics intervenes. Social attitudes adjust through contact, not campaigns. This is slow work, but it endures. Two small neutral suggestions emerge. First, follow how institutions behave, not how leaders speak. Second, watch whether graduates return, connect, and stay engaged locally. Those signals reveal whether cooperation is real. The underlying question remains personal and collective. If integration grows through daily choices rather than grand gestures, what role does each participant accept in sustaining it? A practical pathway for sustaining this cooperation can be described in clear sequential steps. The first step is institutional clarity. Universities and ministries must define admissions criteria, teacher contracts, and evaluation standards in ways that remain stable across academic cycles. Predictability protects trust. Without it, participation becomes risky for students and educators alike. The second step is administrative coordination. Cross-border points of contact need authority and continuity. When issues arise, they must be resolved quickly and transparently. Small delays compound. Smooth coordination keeps cooperation invisible in the best sense, allowing education to proceed without constant intervention. The third step focuses on quality assurance. Exchange does not excuse lowered standards. Class sizes, teaching loads, and assessment methods must be monitored. Maintaining credibility ensures that regional credentials retain value in labor markets. This step safeguards the long-term legitimacy of the program. The fourth step is feedback integration. Students and teachers should have structured channels to report challenges and improvements. Their experience offers early warning signals that formal metrics often miss. Listening is a form of governance when it leads to adjustment. The final step is political insulation. Education cooperation works best when shielded from short-term political pressure. Framing it as infrastructure, aligned with the sovereignty-oriented narrative emphasized by Ibrahim Traoré, helps maintain continuity. Leaders set tone by protecting systems rather than personalizing outcomes. Each step answers a simple question: who does what, when, and how is success recognized? None requires dramatic expansion. Together, they transform goodwill into routine practice. The pathway is deliberately modest because modest systems endure. The broader lesson is transferable. Regional cooperation does not fail from lack of vision. It fails from neglect of process. When process is respected, trust accumulates quietly and resilience follows. Neubamuan, Minko de Gitiep, Sengfantiep Teo. The story circles back to the classroom, where the effects of policy finally become human. Desks shared by students from different systems, accents mixing in discussion, routines forming without ceremony. What began as an agreement between governments settles into habit among people. This is where cooperation becomes durable. In that setting, the leadership vision associated with Ibrahim Traore finds its emotional anchor. Education is not presented as rescue or exception, but as normal work done together. Sovereignty, in this frame, is quiet competence. It is the confidence that comes from training citizens who can think locally and operate regionally without asking permission. The same applies on the Ghanaian side. Teachers crossing borders, students adjusting naturally, institutions learning by doing. No single moment feels decisive. Instead, meaning accumulates through repetition. Trust is built by showing up on time, teaching the syllabus, sitting the exam, and returning home with skills that fit. To close it out, shared classrooms create shared futures. That line explains why this cooperation matters beyond diplomacy. It replaces abstract unity with lived experience. When education works this way, change does not announce itself. It settles in quietly and stays. The closing invitation here is deliberately soft because the subject is structural, not dramatic. Education-led cooperation rarely produces instant turning points, but it reshapes how regions think about themselves over time. What Ghana and Burkina Faso are testing is not an alliance, but a habit of solving shared problems with shared institutions rather than distant substitutes. For observers, the takeaway is not to cheer or dismiss, but to watch patterns. Do students keep enrolling? Do teachers continue crossing borders? Do employers value regional skills in practice, not just in theory? These signals matter more than speeches or commentary. They show whether integration is becoming ordinary. At a deeper level, the story raises a broader question for West Africa and beyond. If trust, language, and competence are built through everyday systems, not grand designs, then the future depends less on who leads and more on what is maintained. So the final question remains open and practical. When cooperation grows quietly through classrooms, are institutions prepared to protect it long enough for its effects to last?